mentioned. So in that last session, we heard a range of different things. We heard from English public health groups who are trying to find the best approaches to e-cigarette regulation, such as allowing e-cigarettes in public places, mandatory sale in shops and those sorts of things. And we also heard about a rather messy international picture with a lot of different regulations. And then we heard from David about the roadmap. And it's good to see that England, we think, is on the right part of the roadmap, although we don't have all the answers yet. Some common themes emerging about how we must have an ideological free zone if we can, separating the nicotine from the tobacco. And actually, Professor Mike Russell, just as a reminder, was saying those sorts of things many years ago before his time, very prescient. So this debate is all around how could the public health response to e-cigarettes better serve the public. And I'd like to invite anybody who hasn't spoken to just say a few words before we open it up to the audience for the final set of questions. So I don't know whether, Lorien, you'd like to say anything at this point.
I think public health, or part of public health, has certainly redeemed itself in the last few months in terms of how it addresses the message it's sending out to smokers about e-cigarettes. However, there's still a lot of confusion. And when you think about the fact that half of the population think that e-cigarettes are as dangerous or more dangerous or even in the same ballpark of danger as cigarettes, you have to question what's gone horribly wrong within public health that we got to that stage. Now, I've been doing this for 3 years, and it's only been in the last 6 months or so that we've started seeing this message change from public health. But the damage that has been done is astronomical, and it's sad and it's depressing to see. And one of the things that lies at the very core of it is ideology, and it's nicotine. This whole idea that somehow smokers are sad, pathetic people because of their nicotine addiction. And then what you're actually doing now is compounding that idea by, on one hand, saying, yeah, by all means, all go try e-cigarettes. What a fantastic thing. But we've also got this new product coming onto the market, or we think you should use this, which are de-nicotinized cigarettes. So on one hand, you're saying nicotine's fine, but then on the other hand, you're saying to people, nicotine's so bad that we actually want you to continue smoking burnt tobacco. We want you to continue inhaling smoke, but don't worry, because this hasn't got the nicotine in. And the whole thing, the messaging around nicotine has to change. It's one of the biggest things that's got to change. And I've been a smoker since I was 12. Nicotine has never actually impaired my behaviour or made me do anything silly. If you sit two people side by side and one of them's got an e-cigarette with nicotine in and the other one just has an e-cigarette with no nicotine in, no matter how long you watch them for, their behaviour's never going to change. You're never going to look at one of them and go, well, they've clearly got the nicotine one because their behaviour has changed somehow. It's not like a pint of water or a pint of gin and running the same experiment. The messaging around nicotine has to change, and it has to be demonised because the damage it's caused is astonishing. And public health are doing better, but that whole idea that half the population think that vaping is as bad as smoking, that has got to change.
Okay, thank you. And Oliver.
It's somewhat hard for me to understand where the locus of responsibility for this actually lies. When I took part in a conference in the United States earlier this year, Mitch Zeller spoke and made the very same point that we need to demonize nicotine, and it is of course true. But what is the route? What is the process to doing that? Whose responsibility is it? I think it's worth noting, of course, that industry is not allowed to do this at all. Actually, hasn't been. And it's obviously, even through subtle messaging, going to be prohibited from doing that in the EU following the advertising restrictions. So the responsibility suddenly becomes much higher on the public health groups to kind of carry the flag, and I really hope they do.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'd now like then to open it up to the audience to ask any questions. I'm particularly looking at for people who haven't asked questions, because I do see a lot of the same hands coming up. Linda hasn't, so...
I wanted to follow on directly from what Lorien and Ollie have just said and actually pose a question both to Shirley and Rosanna. We've talked in the UK about demystifying nicotine, correcting public perceptions for many years, and we haven't come up with an effective way to do that. And I thought that your report, Shirley, was helpful in highlighting misperceptions again. But I just wanted to ask the two of you, if you had a blank sheet of paper not just about e-cigarettes, but generally around nicotine? How would you do that in our context?
Great question. Thank you.
Just could you just say the last bit of your question? What was the actual question,
So,
Linda?
so if we really want to correct these misperceptions about nicotine in the UK population, how do public bodies, how do we go about that? What are the mechanisms? What would you invest in? What would you do?
Well, I guess if we start where we are, I think that as I understand it, being a relative newcomer, I'm much less expert than pretty much everybody else in the room. But as I understand it, local stop smoking services have significant expertise. So I guess pointing people towards seeking help in their quitting is, I think, the best evidence-based approach. So I suppose much more vigour, much higher profile at a local level for those services would be a good thing. I guess a massive expansion in the sort of social marketing type budgets that might help us get those messages out there. Pretty unlikely in this sort of age of austerity, but those sort of social marketing messages that stick with all of us, like 5 a day, that ingrained for all of us, those sorts of messages, I suppose, if we were able to develop something like that around nicotine, would be hugely useful.
Okay, Shirley, do you want to answer?
Well, it would be really nice to start from scratch again, I think, and I have sympathy with Laura's view if you've been here 3 years and you've heard all the sort of negativity, but I think public health is a journey and it is slow, and bringing everybody on side has to involve the evidence, and that takes some time to get to. We did, I think, this summer try our best with the equation of the cup of coffee and nicotine as the equivalents. And I think perhaps we need a lot more around that. And I would agree that I think around a social marketing campaign, because I think there are less expensive ways of getting the message across, especially to young people. And if we were to look at all the different ways we could get those messages out. And think about how the social marketing through Public Health England and others, what's the best value of in terms of how we spend the money or how the money is spent. And we can always argue about that, but smoking continues to be the biggest killer, and therefore, in my book and many other people's book, it has to be, a high, if not the highest priority. And if we've got something that can help people stop, which gives them what they need without all those harmful ingredients, then I think as the last speaker said, that we're on a much better pathway, and it is in the public health. It is our responsibility to get some of these messages out.
Could I just throw something else
Yes.
in, Anne?
Yeah, of course.
I think one of the other things we've been talking about lately is the issue of what do we call them, Martin? Sick smokers. I'm amazed that it isn't an absolutely ingrained duty of everybody who works in the National Health Service to do something when they have a smoker in front of them. If somebody's come in for an ingrowing toenail and they clearly smoke, then what is it you're doing with that person? Don't let them escape without without making that giving that message very clear. I think there are massive opportunities out there if people's thinking and culture shifts around being able to challenge in a way that will help people listen and point people towards the right sort of help.
Okay, gentleman there.
Yeah, Winston Price, pediatrician from the U.S., and I see the quagmire that e-cigarettes are right now, similar to the issue for public health when thimerosal was a questionable issue with respect to vaccines. And the problem we had at that time was that there were a few demagogues beating very loud drums, making a lot of inconsistency statements that caused difficulty for the immunizers. But what happened in that particular scenario is the public health community at large came together and was able to demonstrate through a collective effort of demonstrating the research and the science behind vaccine safety to come together and refute any of the demagogues. One of the things that we need to do in that regard is the same thing with e-cigarettes. I think there's a lot of debate and arguing back and forth between the public health community. I think once you get that back on track, you'll be able to promote e-cigarettes as a safe alternative to cigarettes. That said, I think a lot of the research is coming out of institutions like Johns Hopkins, and I would hope that Johns Hopkins, in its statement to help people by the 100 million, will find ways to also look at communities at risk and find ways to get into the central part of Africa for populations that have the same kind of risk as the more peripheral affluent societies, and also in the Native American community. You have that capability. You're able to generate a presidential candidate. Then you have the ability to get into all communities. Okay. So I hope in your outlook you will find those ways to do that.
Okay. Thank you. And do you want to answer that at all, or should we just move on? Okay, we'll take some more questions before we then do a final wrap-up. So who's got the mic next? Okay, Clive.
It's accidentally been given to me again. All the talk about the end game and sort of bearing down on tobacco, could the panel just reflect on what they think are the limits of state legitimacy in intervening in this marketplace? What should you leave to the choice of individuals and the marketplace, and where should the state go? And where does the state overstep the mark, become a bit of a bully, a bit of a thug when it comes to dealing with ordinary people and their approach to risk?
Anyone want to quickly answer that while we move the mic? Yeah.
Answer is, I think we are obligated to protect kids as best we can from all the substances, but not necessarily to pick out the poor scapegoat of the new kid on the block, e-cigarettes, because they all reflect shared liability and experimentation and risk-taking. But certainly I think we are obligated to tell the truth to everybody about the harm and relative harm, as you've said. I think that's the underlying principle. And then secondly, I agree with you. I think at some level, people do have to make their own choices once they know the facts. And so regulation is a Goldilocks issue, for sure. And it's a fine line between personal freedom and protecting oneself and others. I do think, though, that there is a role to play in trying to speed through every means possible, economic and other, the demise and the obsolescence of the behavior of getting your nicotine through lighting a cigarette, and try to keep it away from kids as best we can, but not overreact to kids and become draconian on nicotine.
Yeah, I had an absolutely horrible experience last year of being on a program called The Moral Maze, where they talk about, the ethical dimensions of this, which is really very interesting because you're surrounded by people with it is sort of the individual versus the sort of nanny state. And it's a very interesting discussion because where we got to on, particularly on smoking, was to say, well, yes, it might be your individual choice to do that, but actually who's looking after you when you get these long-term conditions? So it may be your choice, but your poor family is probably going to have to look after you if you get emphysema. You've got a great cost to the NHS. It isn't just about you at the end of the day. So, it is about all of the systems around you. So that was quite an interesting discussion to have. The other question I would pose is, if we discovered tobacco today, would we allow combustible tobacco products?
Okay, thank you. Right, I can see quite a lot of hands and we're running out of time. So we'll take some quick points from 3 people who get the mic. And then I'll...
Hello there.
Quick points, please.
Well, I'd like to know, maybe you see it as the lesser of 2 evils, but there are 2 very big industries interested in e-cigarettes, and that's obviously big tobacco and the pharmaceutical industry. Which of the 2 would you prefer to get control of this?
Okay, I'm going to take the questions and then final wrap-up. So I've seen a couple of hands in the middle, and Martin I saw here.
Hi, I'm Liam Humberstone from Totally Wicked. I'll start with a comment actually on Oliver said it's hard to know where the locus of responsibility is for the demonisation of nicotine. We earlier heard that in Denmark, dual use is incredibly prevalent. Do you think that there's a coincidence that you can't easily buy e-liquid with nicotine in it in Denmark? The fact that people dual use is that they're having to use zero nicotine fluids. We need to look at those things very carefully. And the locus of responsibility with that is clearly the Denmark authorities who have put vapers in that position. What I'd like to know from the panel is if we'd had a sensible inquiry like the Public Health England report prior to the TPD, just how different would it have looked?
Okay, I can see all of these questions. It could take a very long time to answer.
Hi, Chris Snowden, Institute of Economic Affairs. I'd just like to ask Shirley if she's quite sure she's got the hang of harm reduction. The point of harm reduction is you keep the part of the product that people want and you get rid of the dangerous part. What you're suggesting is getting rid of the part of the product that people want and keeping all the dangers to it. And incidentally, you could buy alcohol-free beer in 1920s America. It didn't stop it being prohibition.
Okay, and the final comment from Martin, so that was the IEA with some funding from the tobacco industry. Martin?
Do I need a mic? Perhaps not. Yes. So, Public Health Organization calls for making e-cigarette sales mandatory. You heard it here first. That's no surprise, that's my public health organization. I'm less convinced about the evidence of outdoor smoking bans, and I'm wondering if the panel thinks that they're justified where e-cigarette use is permitted and smoking is prohibited, because that might provide a kind of gradient of regulation. Might that redeem an outdoor smoking ban?
Okay, sorry. Okay, very quickly, Ricardo, and then the final wrap-up. Sorry.
Going back to the Markov model, everybody here is hoping that the travel will be to west from to east. It's ironic that the regulatory programs, the FDA, deeming regulation, and TPD here in Europe will be a big impediment to this travel. And I wonder what we can do collectively to try to sort this out, although it's a bit late.
Okay, sorry. I'm going to ask the panel now for any quick final comments, and they must be quick. Should we start with Lorien? Anything?
There's a lot of stuff, actually. I want to pick up on what you just said, Martin, pointing out with much affection. No, smoking bans outside are never okay, and at no point can any of us ever support the idea that, well, yeah, have a smoking ban outside, but then, let vapers in the same space. One thing that's missing in all of this is people still aren't understanding the empowerment element of vaping, that no one told you to do it and that you made the decision yourself. The second that you position e-cigarettes against cigarettes in the sense that, well, we'll stop you using those and we'll try and force you to vape, you've lost it. That's the most powerful thing about e-cigarettes is the choice, it's the empowerment. And you have to allow that to happen. It may not bring about your end game as quick as you want it, but ultimately it probably will. You just need to have more patience.
Thank you. Okay. Ryan, anything you'd like to say?
I think I'll just follow up with Martin's as well. I think the idea with policy is that we can use policy to support movement, and if we're using policy together to make it more difficult to smoke and easier to vape, then if that works together, we'll probably get there quicker.
Yeah, probably should answer the one on the denicotization piece, which was not the idea to take the less harmful thing out and leave the bad stuff in. The idea is that if you don't have the addictive nicotine product in combustible tobacco, then you probably won't want to smoke it anyway, and that would lead to the end of smoking. So that's smoking combustible products. So that was the idea, not to make it take out that product and leave the other things in and continue smoking it.
Mike Russell, his dream finally can come true now, and it's actually in the opposite way that he dreamed. We can take the tar out and leave the nicotine. And so he's a South African, so this goes back to my heart. his dream can become reality because we now have the breakthrough technologies for the first time since the cigarette rolling machine caused a century of death and disease, and we should use it.
Thank you very much to our panel. And we've been agonising a bit about the question, trying to find a nuanced question, but we haven't come up with one. So, has the public health response in England to e-cigarettes served the public? All those who think yes, let's have a show of hands. Okay, and all those who think no, a show of hands. Did you not hear the question? Because that's... Okay. Well, okay, so we were going to come on to say, has the public health response to e-cigarettes in England over the last 6 months served the public? So all those who think yes, though the broad public health response, and all those who think no, nothing like biasing the question at the end of the day, and all those who want to abstain. Whoa, okay, thank you. Right.